Thank you, Trevor. And thank you, Helen and Trevor, for the gracious invitation. It's good to be here with you all, even though virtually. Jeremiah 25 is a very unpleasant chapter to read, at least for a modern reader. That's the opinion of Elsie Holt. While not everyone may share that assessment, the chapter depicts terrible judgment upon God's people, exercised through Babylon and couched in terms of destruction and ruin. Despite a brief notation that exile is limited and God's agent Babylon is itself punished, there is no lasting respite and no hope of judgment stayed in the chapter. Rather, the chapter shifts to further judgment that overcomes not only God's people, but all the nations. The judgment is horrific and has been labeled apocalyptic in tenor, in the interest of asserting Yahweh's rule. The scope and intensity of the apocalyptic vision is one whose savageness and totality, says Walter Brueggemann, is difficult to fathom. Working with the textual form found in the Masoretic tradition and focusing on verses 1 through 14, the first of the three chapters as shown on your screen, we find in this first section that the prophetic ministry is summarized in the first 7 verses. The destruction of this land and its inhabitants by Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon is enumerated, and Yahweh's agent of destruction is itself destroyed. Both the summary of prophetic ministry and the horrifying destruction are focalized around 2 servants. The first is Yahweh's servants, the prophets, whom I will refer to as servants of grace. Despite their faithful ministry, the people neither listen nor pay attention. For this reason, Yahweh unleashes his second servant, Nebuchadnezzar, the foreign king, whose ministry is one of destruction and whom I will refer to as a servant of horror. Each of these serve in this paper as entry points to the unit's message and purpose. The designation and actions of prophetic servants is familiar. The designation of a foreign enemy as Yahweh's servant is not familiar. It's very surprising, and his actions terrifying. To help engage the emotional weight of the account of this servant's actions, some insights from the studies of the Rhetoric of Horror will help us open up the scope and purpose of the message for original audience and later readers. Finally, following the exploration of these 2 servants, a further servant is considered. While not so labeled, all that is written in this book, in my opinion, signals a final culminating servant, the written word. Of this servant, the book of Jeremiah is self-consciously aware. This final servant integrates the horror of destruction into a larger whole, thus forestalling the identification of apocalyptic hopelessness by embedding it into something more enduring and hopeful. More, it is this servant in its enduring power that reasserts the prophetic message to listen and to respond. So let's look first at all his servants, the prophets. Because this servant is so familiar, I am only going to give a brief summary of a larger section of my paper. The prophets are the first servant named, and the book presents Jeremiah as a primary witness to their ministry. Prophets as Yahweh's servants is a common Old Testament category, and notably, it aligns them with the great prophet Moses, whom Yahweh repeatedly designates as my servant. It is clear that Jeremiah and Yahweh's servants, the prophets, are those to whom Yahweh has committed a message. The passage begins with a typical introductory formula. The word came to Jeremiah, which is itself a shortened form of the longer, the word came to Jeremiah from Yahweh, which is repeatedly encountered in the book. Jeremiah makes clear that this word has come from Yahweh in verse 3. And his oracle opens with a typical messenger formula in verse 8, and he affirms in verse 9 that the word is as declared by Yahweh. Jeremiah is amongst Yahweh's prophetic servants who are sent by Yahweh in verse 4, which, as we know, is a mark of a true prophet from chapter 23. Finally, Jeremiah notes a prophetic message has been delivered repeatedly over his 23-year ministry. Throughout, his message has been comprised of three major strands, which are familiar. He calls the people to turn from their evil ways and practices, to not walk after other gods, to serve and bow down to them, and to not provoke Yahweh to anger with the work of their hands. The message is recognizable and utilizes key words and phrases that characterize Jeremiah's ministry. Although the message is stern, it is pointed toward a return to covenant faithfulness, and the prophets might thus be termed servants of grace. Should the people respond to the prophetic message, they will bring no harm to themselves, nor will Yahweh harm them. Their attentive response will ensure continuance in the land promised forever and ever. The route to such grace is circumvented by Israel's repeated failure to listen. It's noted many times in the 14 verses. More, the failure is emphasized, for they haven't only not listened, but they have also not paid attention in verse 4. So through all of this, the first servant is familiar in its identity and message. Despite this message, Israel fails to listen. And for this reason, in verse 8, Yahweh sends for a second servant, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So let's look at this second servant. The identity of this servant is unfamiliar. He's also a very striking servant, and he serves, I would say, as a servant of horror within Yahweh's plans. The horror aspect of this servant can be viewed through three different lenses, and to help these reflections, I will be drawing upon the work of the Rhetoric of Horror. First, the servant is an unexpected and terrifying foe. The designation of Nebuchadnezzar, an agent of destruction, as Yahweh's servant is unusual and unexpected. For this reason, some actually credit it as a later interpolation. But the Masoretic text names here one it has already identified in chapter 21, and thus the Masoretic presentation of Nebuchadnezzar, my servant, need not be extirpated, in my opinion, despite its surprising assertion. To be named Yahweh's servant is recognition of a favored position given those who are particularly endeared to Yahweh. Not only prophets, but Abraham, David, Jacob, and/or Israel, and the suffering servant are so designated. Without fail, these individuals are part of the covenant people of God and are so named due to their attentive obedience or close relationship to Yahweh. No foreigner, especially one who's an enemy of Israel, has the title except Nebuchadnezzar. Even Cyrus, the restorer of God's covenant people, is only my shepherd and my anointed. As a foreign enemy who is also Yahweh's servant, Nebuchadnezzar could be considered as a monstrous entity within the genre of horror. As a horror monster, he has an affective power that elicits from its audience a combination of fear and disgust. This affect responds to a creature that combines in one being two categories that should not stand together. So horror examples include the living dead, like vampires and zombies, or animal humans, like werewolves. In Noel Carroll's monograph, The Philosophy of Horror, he differentiates between types of monsters. There are those, he says, that we encounter in myth and fairy tale, which are part of the everyday furniture and not unnatural in the world of the myth or the fairy tale. By contrast, he says, the monsters of horror, quote, breach the norms of ontological propriety, which is presumed by the positive human characters in the story. That is, in examples of horror, it would appear that the monster is an extraordinary character in our ordinary world, whereas in myths and fairy tales, the monster is an ordinary creature that arises within an extraordinary world, end quote. Carroll's categorization of horror monsters illuminates Nebuchadnezzar as an extraordinary creature in our ordinary world. He is a monstrous crossover category, at the same time foreign enemy and Yahweh's servant. And as such, he breaches the ontological propriety presumed by Israel and evokes both fear and disgust. It is perhaps this breached propriety which lies behind Habakkuk's dismay that Yahweh utilizes a hated foreign people to execute his plans. And when you name such a one my servant, that heightens the ontological disjuncture. The consideration of Nebuchadnezzar as a horror monster is further illuminated when identified with Jeremiah's dreaded northern foe, whose otherness is apparent. The fantastical foe is like a pot spilling out from the north. In chapters 4 through 6, the foe issues as a lion from his lair, rides with the sound of the roaring sea, is a scorching wind that advances like a whirlwind. And at his approach, the earth is undone in a cataclysmic decreation. His archers, his horsemen leave Jerusalem gasping for breath, like a woman in labor fainting before murderers. Surely such descriptions of the northern foe underlie chapter 25's presentation of Nebuchadnezzar, joining to him even further crossover categories. He's also an animal, a destructive force of nature, and an Ubermensch warrior. Adding these crossover attributes to that of a foreign enemy as servant heightens Nebuchadnezzar's terrifying identity as a horror monster. Yet a further element contributes to his identity as a horror monster. He is Yahweh's agent in history. Of him, God declares, I've destroyed the nations by his hand in chapter 27. And throughout Jeremiah, he repeatedly indicates God's actions against Israel correspond to Nebuchadnezzar's actions in history. In our verses, God's agency is apparent as God repeatedly couches in first-person assertions, I am assuming, I will bring, I will destroy, I will expel, etc. Nebuchadnezzar is thus joined to God as his agent, and through him, God wields destructive power. The coupling significantly magnifies the crossover category in which Nebuchadnezzar is placed. Finally, the terrifying and monstrous nature of the servant is heightened by the unexpected scope of the destruction. In verses 1 through 7, the focus for judgment falls only on Israel. The servant, however, is summoned against Israel and all the surrounding nations in verse 9, who together will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. The servant wields power in an unexpected scope. And in doing so, he even acts beyond the fantastical, otherworldly descriptions of the northern foe's actions, and even beyond God's own purposes. It is such excess which appears to be related to his pride, and we know that from chapter 15. But whatever its motivation, the excess is such that God must punish the king of Babylon and his nation for their guilt in verse 12. By overriding appointed boundaries to the point that divine intervention is required, he is shown as a terrifying northern servant indeed. Nebuchadnezzar is summoned as Yahweh's servant, as a terrible crossover monster that even exceeds his remit. He is someone or something described in the terminology of horror. Let's turn now to look at the servant's work. And I'm going to use here the categories of direct and indirect horror, which arise out of Amy Kalmanovsky's work in Jeremiah, entitled Terror All Around. Like Carroll, she notes that horror's defining characteristic is at the affective level. In horror, audiences are drawn in, experiencing the emotions of the characters within the narrative. Fear is a primary compelling affect, but horror also involves the affect of disgust or repulsion, as well as shame. In her discussion of horror, Kalmanowski categorizes two types, direct and indirect horror. Indirect horror, there is a monstrous aggressor, such as Yahweh's agent, Nebuchadnezzar. The actions of the aggressor produce an emotional response to an immediate and threatening entity. And these emotions include feelings like being dismayed or terrorized or shattered. In indirect horror, there is a monstrous vanquished that arouses in onlookers an emotional reaction to the destruction. Kalmanowski traces the affect of direct and indirect horror through the study of particular verbal roots, hatat for direct and shamam, with the related nominals of shama and shamama for indirect horror. The verbal forms actually are not present in Jeremiah 25, and perhaps for this reason, she doesn't include it in her study. But the related nominals, shama and shamama, which are indicative of indirect horror, do appear. By her lexical criteria, the emotions of direct horror are not present, yet I think they are, in that there still remains the monstrous aggressor, which is requisite to direct horror. Kalmanowski's lexical criteria more clearly affirm the presence of indirect horror, emotion expressed at the description of the monstrous vanquished. This response is that of onlookers within the textual world. But we can also consider additional onlookers. These might be those who witnessed or heard the prophetic oracle when it was delivered and who imaginatively observe the prophesied destruction. But there are also onlookers observing the textual world, that is, the readers of the compiled text. Each of these will figure in the following discussion as it turns to examine the rhetoric of horror through a clustering of terms in verses 9 through 11, which is here on the screen for you. Beside the presence of the monstrous aggressor, additional elements of horror are apparent in the passage. First, the servant is instructed by Yahweh to completely destroy in verse 9. The root, of course, is haram, which appears most frequently in Yahweh war against Israel's enemies. What is of note is that Yahweh here acts in warfare against his own people, as well as surrounding nations. For a nation whose past includes Yahweh fighting for them to redeem them out of Egypt and to fight for them through Haram warfare as they go into the land, to apply this now to Israel can only be a shock. Given the inherent destruction of Haram warfare, its long and terrible history in ancient Near Eastern warfare accounts, and its present application against Israel, one can imagine in those who heard the oracle and who later read the passage an affective response of fear and shame that God's own people merited such a visitation from God. Second, through the servant, Yahweh renders the land and its inhabitants a horror, shema, and an object of scorn, sharaka. The term shema is one of Kalmanowski's identifiers of indirect horror, that is, the emotional response of onlookers to the vanquished plight. In this passage, onlookers are not specifically noted, but I think they can be rightfully assumed. And I say this because Jeremiah uses these two terms together in chapter 18 and in chapter 19, and in both instances, onlookers are specified as being there and seeing what's happening. They are appalled and they express emotion through physical actions like shaking their heads and scoffing. The same constellation of horror and scorn appears here, making it likely that passersby are respondents to the horror. For them, the devastated serve as terrifying and shame-inducing warnings that remind them of their own weaknesses and potential for a similar shameful fate. In the same way, this whole land is described as a ruin and again as a horror in verse 11. The descriptor recalls both the objective reality of horrific destruction and gives voice to the emotive affect of those who experience and observe the devastation. Third, the land and its inhabitants become an everlasting ruin in verse 9. Again, the phrase signals the objective reality of the destruction. You can imagine the burned temple, the destroyed walls and houses. These are the work of a monstrous aggressor. For those who initially heard Jeremiah's oracle, and for those who read it subsequently, the declaration of ruin might also evoke their response of fear, disgust, and shame over an observed destruction. Fourth and finally, the destruction entails a cessation of voices of joy and bridal festivities. Additionally, the daily round of activity, typified by the millstone and lamp, is disrupted. The collation describes well the objective realities of the destruction, but also suggests the affective reality of those whose lives are about to be, and then are, overturned and displaced by Yahweh's servant. Instead of joy and gladness, the affect, the silence attendant on terrifying loss. Together, these descriptors communicate in a visceral fashion the reality of loss and destruction, and also the response of its various observers. As such, these terms serve the rhetoric of horror. Let's turn then to look at the servant's work being repaid with the question of, does it provide any hope? After Yahweh's servant enslaves these nations for 70 years, the king of Babylon and his nation are themselves enslaved. God repays Babylon, and punishment for guilt brings desolation, shamama, another indirect horror word. In this reversal and repayment, the monstrous aggressor is shorn of his monstrousness, but there is no real respite. And as the chapter continues, the horror continues through Yahweh, whom Kalmanowski terms a divine horror monster. The nations, with Jerusalem and Judah heading the list, and the Ubermensch king of Babylon closing it, must drink the cup of Yahweh's wrath. One might conclude that horror wins the day, or at least the chapter. Elsie Holt, in her work with Jeremiah 25 and in interaction with Kalmanowski, she does not identify God as monstrous in this passage, but she does argue the chapter contains elements of horror and is apocalyptic in scope, a last judgment. And here she's drawing on terminology from Doom. In Holt, it is in fact an apocalyptic that has gone astray. She concludes her examination of the chapter with telling words. Let me quote her. Somehow it seems that the fantasy of the destruction of the world has seized the author so strongly that he forgets what he wanted to obtain from the beginning, namely, to bring hope of at least revenge over the destroyers of Jerusalem, Babylon, and its king, Nebuchadnezzar. The ferociousness of the images of the cup of wrath and the roaring lion grasps the author, so that when he looks around, the whole world is dejected by his frenetic anger in an all-encompassing destruction without mercy. One way or another, then, Holt concludes, it becomes rather hard to identify any vestige of hope in the fantasies of Jeremiah 25. Does the passage, as Holt asserts, hold out no hope, as if an apocalypse gone astray? Is all that is left for God's nation a divine horror monster? Such conclusions might be made of the pericope. Yet mitigating against such a conclusion are two things: the purposes of horror's rhetoric and the final servant, noted in verses 1 through 14. Let's look first briefly at the rhetoric of horror and its purposes. Considering Nebuchadnezzar through the rhetoric of horror illuminates his person and work. He is a monstrous aggressor. He's a crossover figure who is yet the servant of an all-powerful deity. He is summoned as Yahweh's agent, and his work is described in categories of total destruction that reflect the fear, disgust, and shame experienced not only by the objects of destruction, but by those who witness it. Yet the rhetoric of horror is not employed simply to demonstrate how frightful is this servant of Yahweh. There's a lot more at stake here than the spine-tingling fright of a good vampire flick. Rather, Kalmanowski notes that the purposes of horror are to engage and horrify, yes, but to do so as a means to an end. And that end, she says, is ultimately to reform Israel. As such, the rhetoric of horror is a powerful tool that terrifies and disgusts, repels and attracts, but works to shock God's people and confront their sinful behavior with the threat of judgment through Nebuchadnezzar. So let's turn to look at the final servant. The rhetorical purposes of horror continue when considered within the final servant of verses 1 through 14. Now, this servant is not given the label of a servant, as have the prophets in Nebuchadnezzar, but I would say it is a servant nevertheless, and it is the function, it is the word of God that endures and is powerful. The servant is alluded to in the reference to this book which Jeremiah has prophesied against the nations. And while there is debate as to what this book actually comprises, for the purposes of this investigation, its precise parameter is not required. Instead, what is pertinent is the chapter's self-conscious reference to Jeremiah's words preserved in a written document. The self-consciousness of a written work is pervasive in Jeremiah. Think of the familiar account in chapter 36, where you have a written document that is over the course of the chapter almost recognized on its own account as God's word that has authority, and to which at the end of the chapters, other words are added. There are also numerous references beyond that in chapter 25, verse 13, to the written character of Jeremiah's work, his letters, and so on. The reference in verse 13 to a book or a scroll containing Jeremiah's prophecies against all the nations sets the horrors of chapter 25 into a written context. Initially, that context is the scroll referenced in verse 13. But in light of Jeremiah's self-conscious referentiality to its written character throughout the book, chapter 25, I would say, must ultimately be viewed within the context of the written book as a whole, the collection of oracles, biographical accounts, and sermons related to the prophet Jeremiah. This book begins with the prophetic calling, which sets the ministry of Jeremiah and prophets, or Jeremiah, pardon me, as a prophet, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and plant. As part of this whole, the destructive horrors of Jeremiah 25 are indeed part of the message of destruction, but also part of the message of building and planting, of restoration. We know that restoration clusters in Jeremiah in chapter 30 through 33, but there are significant moments of restoration noted in chapter 3 and 16 and 23, for instance. Additionally, the promises of turning and returning and restoration, which are inherent in the book's key verb, shuv, sets the horrors of chapter 25 within these promises of restoration and the call to repentance itself. The purposes of the rhetoric of horror are not altered when set within the larger whole. Rather, they contribute to the message of that whole. In a written book, the rhetoric of horror serves to engage, to horrify, and ultimately to reform, as Kalmanowski says, but now not only for Israel, but for all subsequent audiences. Through the rhetoric of direct horror, subsequent readers can enter into the experiential world of threatened Judah and Jerusalem. Through the rhetoric of indirect horror, they can observe and reflect upon the horror. As Kalmanowski notes, the rhetoric of horror ensures that they are not complacent readers who maintain an emotional distance from the characters. Horror demands that its audience identifies with its characters, experience their horror, yet at the same time, they must maintain enough distance to understand what is happening to them and to care for them. The rhetoric of horror, Kalmanowski concludes, helps readers maintain this balance. These affective purposes of horror remain in the written book. Jeremiah 25 inundates with horror imagery that engages its audience, drawing it in as listeners are confronted by a horrible, monstrous aggressor in the servant Nebuchadnezzar. But within the context of the whole of Jeremiah's message, preserved in a written book, there is no apocalypse gone astray, no horror monster that seeks only to terrify and destroy. In the canonical context of destruction and restoration, the rhetoric of horror does not have the final say. As part of a whole message, it now serves Yahweh, as did the prophets, his servants, who called Israel to listen, to turn, to serve God alone, and to remain in his promises. The passage's rhetoric of horror now serves the word, the written word, God's enduring servant, as it seeks those who will attend and turn and serve Yahweh alone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lissa. Let's all show our appreciation for that tremendous keynote and such a fruitful lens for looking at Jeremiah 25. Thank you so much. Remember that as questions arise, feel free to put those in the public chat. I'll be keeping an eye on those so that when we come to our discussion time at the end, I'll be able to call on you, and you won't have to simply remember all of the wonderful insights and questions that were raised by each presentation. Up next, we have Dr. Luke.